Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Profiteers vs. the People, where we myth bust the biographical narratives of the famously wealthy. Like our last episode, this too will be a RadBill Shorty, meaning it's just going to be you and I. So, the ever-present question, are people naturally good or evil, has always felt benign to me, and most times I've heard the question posed, it was by someone who just wanted to argue. But as I've grown, I've realized that the reason this question has always felt sort of meaningless is because everyone already has their mind made up on it. That doesn't, however, make the question unimportant. In fact, your answer to this question likely dictates your entire worldview. Either people are naturally good, civil, and gentle, and they need to be trusted, enabled, advocated for, and assisted when necessary, and otherwise left to their own devices, or society exists despite human nature and needs to be protected from the public, and people need to be controlled, surveilled, dominated, and protected from themselves. If you believe people are good, you're likely to advocate for people to be given the tools to succeed. You're probably not extremely excited about increases in military spending, probably pretty open to the idea of more people moving to where you are. Long story short, you're probably more progressively inclined. And if you believe that stability and society are not compatible with human nature, chances are you're more sensitive to social disorder and more inclined to be supportive of a stronger police force. You probably believe that society is fragile, that the established norms are dependable, and society can weaken if its members stray too far socially from the tried and true. You likely believe that societies like the one we live in are scarce, owing to their unnatural presence, and thus an appealing destination or target to outsiders. In this episode, we're going to dig further into some of Steven Pinker's widely held and widely disseminated worldview, or whether or not humanity is generally a force for good. Our next episode will be covering Sam Altman, who seeks to save the world through modernization, and we're hoping that we can first determine whether or not people need saving from the likes of Sam Altman or Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or whoever to begin with. I'm RadBill. Oh, yeah, are we not doing the... So, the earliest known alcoholic beverage was enjoyed about 1,000 years before the Bible suggests that the universe existed at all. Residues of the beverage were found on some early pottery in Jiahu, a Neolithic village in the Yellow River Valley. Some historians are now suggesting that wheat farming gained traction as a means to steadily produce alcohol, and that bread was actually just a byproduct of this desire to keep drinking. But as we progressed, quotation marks, into the Middle Ages, the production of alcohol gained new importance. Alcohol was correctly believed to be a safe alternative to shit-filled river water. So, European men, women, and children had alcohol with every meal, and they did this for centuries. The West spent basically an entire millennium just piss-ass drunk. In the 17th century, when coffee made its way to Europe, people suddenly had a new excrement-free beverage with which they could start their day and weather their generational hangovers. All at once, massive swaths of society began to sober up. The West finally had its designated drivers. Before long, coffee houses became massively important social gathering spaces and became fertile ground for revolutionary thinking. Mark Pendergrast credits the coffee house as the birthplace for the French and American revolutions. Indeed, the mob that stormed the Bastille and kicked off the French Revolution first huddled up at Café des Foy. Definitely mispronouncing that. In fact, the Enlightenment movement at large is believed to be directly or indirectly attributable to coffee and the revolutionary nature of this time period. Its advent is bookended by the Glorious Revolution and French Revolution, two events of historical proportion where communities banded together to do away with the rule of law. Now, this would suggest that one of the most significant periods of societal advancement in the history of the West, quote unquote, was the result of an energized proletariat demanding that we start from scratch and largely maintaining order when all rules of civil society were undone. Now, I imagine Pinker would cede this point to yours truly, although it runs counter to his beliefs as they are written. In his books, Enlightenment Now and The Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker seeks to describe our largely successful evasion of our own savage nature through enlightenment and modernity. The discoveries and systems we've created, Pinker would argue, are what separate man from beast. And if we abandon these systems, we will be reduced to savagery once again, left to our own devices in a bitter and ceaseless feud with one another to determine who's in charge. But here's the thing, where did he get the idea that without rule of law, people are beasts? When have we actually been beasts or beastly? In The Better Angels of Our Nature, Pinker cites the story of Otzi, a 52-year-old, 52-year-old, a 5,200-year-old mountaineer discovered in the German Alps with an arrowhead in his back and a big old gash on his hand. He was so well preserved in this ice that these German mountaineers found him in that scientists were able to determine how old he was when he died. And as Pinker sees it, this man didn't die of natural causes. He was murdered, likely by a neighboring tribe. He was a raider, a monster, traveling the wasteland looking for victims. Pinker uses this anecdote, as he often tends to with anecdotes, to illustrate the nature of this entire time period and to help forge a narrative that humans have gotten less violent with time. According to Pinker, hunter-gatherers governed only by human nature, or the state of nature, as philosophers call it, were brutally competitive, savagely cruel, and eager to resort to violence or even murder when the situation demanded it. Pinker and Thomas Hobbes, who's another author who shares Pinker's sentiment here, attribute the gradual pacification of humanity to centralized governance and authority and the monopolization of force by the state. What this seems to suggest is that humans are naturally chaotic and violent and will fall into chaos if a shepherd is not there to herd and guide them. Indeed, the data in Better Angels of Our Nature suggests that a whopping 15% of ancient hunter-gatherers died at the hands of other human beings. The share of violent deaths then steadily dropped as humanity progressed to the modern era, finally dropping to 2% in the 20th century and 1% in the 21st century. And you know what? That's big. That's big. I guess humanity was saved by centralized authority. So that's that. Sorry, Stephen. I guess I was wrong to question you here. Except, no, I wasn't. As it turns out, the data that Pinker uses to paint a picture of gradual decline in violence was all from one study. And this study cherry picked the ancient hunter gatherer societies that were believed to be violent. Furthermore, it was assumed 40% of one of these ancient communities died violently because of a gravesite where bodies were found with arrowheads in them. But many anthropologists object to the idea that these people were violently killed, suggesting instead that these hunter-gatherers were ceremoniously buried with their hunting tools, which is kind of normal behavior. Other larger, equally ancient burial sites, not included in Pinker's data, by the way, have been unearthed that show evidence of zero violent deaths. More credible people who actually study anthropology put the percentage of violent deaths among ancient hunter-gatherer tribes between 3 and 5%. Not a low number, but a pretty huge departure from Pinker's 15% stab at it. Pinker includes a handful of more modern hunter-gatherer tribes in an attempt to highlight the violence inherent to modern human nature in the absence of law. And here, things get really interesting. Pinker includes a handful of more modern hunter-gatherer tribes in an attempt to say, hey, so communities who still behave this way exhibit similar amounts of violence. And this is where things get really interesting. One of the subgroups of more modern hunter-gatherers Pinker includes had a 30% violent death rate, which is unbelievable. What Pinker neglects to mention, though, was that this hunter-gatherer community were being hunted by slavers and colonists. Unsurprisingly, these slavers and colonists were responsible for, a massive majority of these violent deaths. The civilized society that Pinker ironically champions was kicking down the doors and killing the shit out of these people. Similarly, the Hiwi people in Colombia and Venezuela, also included in Pinker's dataset, suffered basically the exact same fate. They were a peaceful community, as it turns out, and they were being viciously hunted by colonists. Colonists were responsible for every single violent death suffered by the Hiwis. A literal colonialist massacre was included in Pinker's dataset to drive home the point that without centralized authority, human beings are savages. Think about that. Pinker is accusing these tribes of being savages. His writing suggests that centralized authority could be a saving grace for them. But in fact, they were killed via genocide by these very same civilized societies. When given the full story, what Pinker's data actually suggests is that when use of force is monopolized by the state and elites, it's seemingly administered for the benefit of the state and the elites who wield it, often to the detriment of everyone else. So there we have it. Pinker has warped and twisted existing data to reinforce the idea that if it weren't for modern societal systems, people would kill the hell out of each other. It'd be blood in the streets. What's funny, though, is by only studying the difference between modern societies and societies that haven't modernized the same way, Pinker fails to address the potential consequences of civilized society crumbling, of the rule of law that we've established falling away, which seems to be the entire reason that his books were written, to defend the current status quo and to caution against us moving away from that status quo. So, how do people behave when they had central authority as a guide and it suddenly crumbled at their feet? One would imagine that this scenario would bring out the most sinister and extreme aspects of our existence as a species, but as it turns out, people actually do pretty great in these scenarios. The book A Paradise Built in Hell explores centuries of data supporting these optimistic findings, using massive historical disasters as case studies. The book shares a quote from esteemed disaster researcher Charles Fritz that reads as follows: Movement towards the disaster area is usually both quantitatively and qualitatively more significant than flight or evacuation from the scene of destruction. Within minutes following most disasters, thousands of people begin to converge on the disaster area and on first aid stations and hospitals and relief and communication centers, all in that disaster environment. People are running into the fire, not away from it. Shortly following, tons of unsolicited equipment and supplies of clothing, food, bedding, and other materials begin arriving in the disaster area. This observation is accurate for every disaster that Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, covers. In the 1906 earthquake, San Francisco was decimated. Most critical infrastructure failed, and rule of law was largely unenforceable. As soon as the shaking subsided, regular people emerged from the ruins of their former lives and sprang into action to help their fellow man. It was orderly, not panicked, not savage. A beautician emerged after the shaking subsided to find her business destroyed and was ultimately directed to Golden Gate Park, where many of the displaced gathered and spent their homeless nights. After this earthquake, by the way, about half of San Francisco was homeless. On day 3 of living in the park, she stitched together blankets, carpets, and sheets to make housing for a few dozen people, including 13 children. She offered to cook for them. They all shared one pie plate and were drinking out of the same tin can until people began offering remaining dishes and silverware and supplying funds for cooking and dining materials. Within days, the beautician was providing routine free sustenance for hundreds. Strangers had sifted through wreckage nearby to help find any useful cooking equipment for her operation, and some strangers from a mining town in Nevada began carting in supplies for her to distribute. Her kitchen would come to be known as the Mitzvah Cafe. Thousands of these makeshift operations sprang up throughout San Francisco. Made from the wreckage, these operations offered free food and drink and donned funny signs. They became a symbol of San Francisco's rebirth following the earthquake. Newspapers began publishing daily lists of those missing and offering places for separated family members to meet. As such, people were calm and organized. Survivor recalls that the city became a wonderland, traveling through the rubble of the old world. One could hear the murmuring of couples who sought refuge, and down every street you could hear the gentle tinkle of guitars and mandolins. The marriage clerk noted that during April and May of that year, at the depths of the fallout from the earthquake, he collected more marriage licensing fees than he had during those months from any other year of his entire career. Now, I would argue situations like this are a perfect little demonstration of how people behave in a state of natural law. This is who you are. It's in you right now. People aren't savage or lawless in the absence of authority. Their instincts skew towards altruism and are brilliant. They often reflexively coalesce to form fabulous, orderly, and well run bottom up rescue and recovery machines. Even if you wanted to argue that people are well meaning in nature but not orderly, the data for that isn't there. When the scope of a disaster surpasses the limits of our current systems, onlookers often surprise even themselves as they rush into life threatening situations heart first. Following 9/11, the press seized on the stories of first responders to construct the narrative of masculine heroism, but the response from the public was the stuff of legends. We didn't hear much of the people stealing yachts and carting 100 survivors at a time across the Hudson, the hundreds of people in the subway stations around Ground Zero comforting and tending to survivors, the therapists and masseuses who dropped everything to be there for people clearing the site and looking for survivors. The people wrapped around the block, feeding into the streets, waiting to give blood. The people cold calling hotels about donating rooms for the displaced. The line cooks and food handlers who ran impromptu kitchens for months in some cases. Massive crowds sprung to action, frantically looking to help any way they could. Cough drops at one point were requested because first responders grappling with the rubble of the Twin Towers were getting sore throats. And by the end of the day, every cough drop in Manhattan was at ground zero. In fear of potential hate crimes against her community in Brooklyn, the Palestinian born Amira Habibi Brown put out an internet ad asking for volunteers to escort Arabic women and children outside, and soon had removed the ad due to the deluge of volunteers. Near immediately, their small community had 1,200 volunteers ready to drop everything and escort kids to school and women to work. Volunteers greatly outnumbered potential perpetrators of the hate crimes that Amira feared. Now, disasters as a data set are pretty rare overall, but for more reproducible demonstration on the virtues of human nature, consider how far producers of reality TV have to go to present people as savage or hostile. During confessionals, members of the production team will sit out of frame and do whatever they can to spark rivalries, produce tears, and encourage conflict. Efforts to force drama are wide ranging and constantly required. People get paid big money to push aspiring celebrities to get mean, even when the status quo and all of our possessions are intact and we're being implored to be monsters in exchange for potential fame and fortune. We're just too damn civil. Hostility towards our fellow man is utterly outside of our nature. Ironically, although Pinker is dead wrong about your very most basic nature, he's actually spot on when it comes to those in power. But again, not really. As it turns out, his belief in the resilience of centralized power is disproven in every disaster explored by SolNet, often laughably so. While the general populace rushes towards the disaster, reflexively offering whatever they can to anyone that they see suffering, those at the top, particularly those less affected by the disaster, do whatever they can to maintain and restore the status quo, often at great cost to the recovery effort. In 1906, Brigadier General Funston, the commanding officer at the Presidio military base, saw it as his duty to save earthquake-stricken San Francisco from its own people. He ordered his troops to march on the city, quote, in an effort to assist the municipality, unquote. Although martial law hadn't been declared, many soldiers just assumed it had been. After the occupation began, the military began chasing away those who were, until that point, very successfully extinguishing burning buildings, instead choosing to let some buildings burn and choosing to blow up others. Now, blowing up burning buildings is not unheard of, but crucially, instead of using dynamite, which explodes without igniting its surroundings, the military instead elected to use gunpowder, which spread the fires far and wide. The day the troops arrived, the mayor of the city issued the following proclamation: the federal troops, the members of the regular police force, and all special police officers have been authorized by me to kill any and all persons engaging in looting or in the commission of any other crime. What followed was the largest gathering of military forces in an urban center in the country's history. The Navy, Marines, National Guard, and college aged military cadets all gathered in the streets of San Francisco and got to work commanding the public at gunpoint, killing somewhere between 50 and 500 civilians, many of whom were killed in the midst of altruistic efforts. One man was shot in the back as he attempted to dig a survivor out of the rubble. The understanding among the military men was that total demoralization was close, and as such, rioting was imminent. So, to prepare for this and to prevent widespread looting, soldiers stormed liquor stores and grocery stores, destroying the entire stock of alcohol and arguably doing more damage than looters would have in the first place. In one incident, a grocer whose store was obviously doomed to go up in flames invited the public to take what they could grab before the building ignited. A passing group of soldiers saw people leaving with groceries and bayoneted the nearest patron leaving the grocery store. Each day, reports abounded of soldiers being excessively violent, invading campsites, barking orders, and shooting down men and women who disobeyed. The bulletin, at one point, reported of one instance where the occupying forces lined up and executed 20 men on the waterfront for not helping to extinguish a fire. Wealthy San Franciscans advocated for these efforts, urging suppression of the general public who were rumored to have been seeking retribution from a few of the less affected wealthy enclaves. There was absolutely no evidence to support these rumors. In another similar incident, in the wake of the Mexico City earthquake, police arrived and began prohibiting the public from making rescue attempts to survivors trapped in the rubble. Donated foreign aid was siphoned off, tents and other donated supplies were lost, and once again, police and the military were sent into the city with the express purpose of coming down hard on looters. The recovery effort following an earthquake in Nicaragua was derailed twice by the ruling class. After their corrupt government bungled recovery efforts in the name of maintaining power, Nicaraguans revolted and installed a new government, and they enjoyed a wonderful celebratory period before their newly formed government was sabotaged by the Reagan administration, which inserted another authoritarian. During 9/11, heads of the police and fire department were unable to put their differences aside. Although police were able to radio back to ground forces, they refused to work with the fire department, who didn't have such capabilities at that moment. As a result, the fire department was unable to verify which floors had been checked, and the number of firefighters in the buildings during their collapse was double what it should have been. In the days that followed, 200 impromptu volunteers converted the Pier 59 warehouse into a massive support center for first responders. It ran brilliantly until it was commandeered, first by the National Guard, then by the Army, and as more and more top down organizations intervened, the red tape grew. The agile, do what you can attitude that the massive commissary demanded to function was replaced by a sluggish, feuding, bureaucratic series of centralized authorities. Last and most hauntingly, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, authorities and government officials turned New Orleans into a makeshift prison colony for those who couldn't afford to leave. A perimeter was formed around the flooded city, and supplies and rescuers were turned away. Soon, rumors of hundreds of rapes and murders among survivors were circulated by almost every news station. Weeks later, all of these reports would be very quietly recanted. The Astrodome Stadium, which was used as a makeshift refugee camp, was supposedly the site of a vast majority of these rumored crimes. 20,000 people were sent and eventually imprisoned there, and over the course of their confinement, the actual death toll was 6. Only 2 of which were violent deaths, by the way, out of 20,000 people. During their stay at the Astrodome, prisoners would watch clean water and food fly past the stadium via helicopter and be dropped from 50 feet in the air. The water bottles would explode on the pavement below, as would the food. The refugees, able to make it past the armed authorities guarding the perimeter and to the site of the impact, would gather what little food remained intact and bring it back to share with the elderly and the infants residing in the stadium. Police in a bordering community that served as a bottleneck for those who did manage to leave New Orleans deputized and armed white residents who had stayed back to prevent looting of their homes. Looting events, by the way, were greatly overstated. It was pointed out that while white survivors gathering supplies from flooded storefronts were portrayed by the news as gathering supplies, black men doing the same thing were almost exclusively labeled as looters. But back to the story. Many of these newly deputized white residents began hunting injured survivors and inbound rescue teams attempting to traverse the community, at least 7 of whom were murdered. Solnit calls this routinely demonstrated behavior elite panic. Elite panic in disaster scenarios stems from a strong belief among the elites in social Darwinism. Very few on the top have reached that summit by acting on behalf of their community or out of the goodness of their heart, and they can't imagine that anyone else can operate differently than they do. Further, they know that if the rules change, there's a strong possibility that their position at the top of the food chain will be contested. This ideology stipulates that the general populace needs to be controlled and that the current system needs to be preserved at all costs. Rumors of human savagery in the wake of social tension or crises circulate quickly among elites, and suppression efforts are mobilized rapidly in response. In Paradise Built in Hell, Rebecca Solnit notes that the press often focus on the accounts of those suffering from incredible loss, the folks at the epicenter. Concern, fear, and rumors abound furthest away, and in the middle ground, the space between those speculating and those mourning, where in major disasters there are injuries, but the losses equate mostly to just everything you own and rule of law. In those areas, people are miraculously happy. Those suffering are tended to eagerly by complete strangers, and there's little complaining, no panic, and above all, there's joy. Many survivors of these massive events recall those moments as some of the fondest of their entire lives. Stephen Doheny Farina recalls that during the massive ice storm that took out power for much of the northeastern United States in 1998, he, a college professor, was forced to become a clumsy but coachable handyman, learning how to help neighbors improvise and navigate a two-way generator, and et cetera, et cetera. When the power finally returned, he just had to go back to grading papers. In a way, he was heartbroken, but then suddenly the power went out again. He jumped to his feet, looked out the windows, and started making calls. When it was undeniable that power was out again, he was overjoyed, saying, "It was like all that energy had poured out of the grid and into me." Most people recall participating in these disaster communities as being among the most meaningful and fulfilling part of their entire lives. They're boundlessly happy. So why would anyone go back? Why not rebuild using these principles or the principles of these communities that you've built to guide you? The fact of the matter is that as it stands currently, there is a utopia that exists within the status quo. Only it's reserved for a few. This utopia is built on the backs of the middle class to accommodate those at the very top. They get to live like this every day. But these disaster utopias don't sustain them or their utopia in the same way it does for us. It occurs to me at the time of recording that many of these people are not consciously aware of the stakes they're acting on. But I think there's a world that emerges from these moments that they subconsciously refuse to entertain. Who's going to buy the product I make if everyone is sharing what they already own to help others in need? What peace am I required to keep if peace is getting along perfectly fine keeping itself? From what penalties or laws am I exempt if no one is being penalized at all? Who is donating to my campaign or fighting to earn my favor if everyone is self-governing and political objectives are being accomplished from the ground up? To this end, it's important to be wary of any rescue plan being proposed by those who have built a utopia atop the status quo. What we are so overjoyed to escape is the utopia that they've built for themselves, and it is far more costly than a utopia for everyone else. On the next episode, we'll be exploring the life and vision of Sam Altman, the founder of OpenAI, and we'll be dissecting the world that he plans to create to save us from the obstacles that he has also created. Thank you so much for listening. Let us know if we got anything wrong. If you just want to say hi, if you miss Money Mike, like I do, and want to tell him you're excited for his return, shoot us an email at profitversepeeps@gmail.com or drop us a note on our subreddit. We love you all and look forward to hearing from you.